You alright? My name's Paul, I've got autism, and I make random videos based on my version of autism and the way my head works, and I stick the videos on the internet just in case you fancy giving them a watch. And I hope you're doing alright. So, a request video to talk about ABA therapy, my opinion on it, and we'll see where we end up. The problem is it's a very tricky topic to talk about. For the simple reason is you will either be vehemently against it or you will be in favour of it. There's generally never a middle ground on ABA therapy. But what I will say, and the only reason I'm saying it is because it makes sense to say, is I'm allowed my opinion, you're allowed your opinion, and we don't need to fall out over it. There's never a problem with constructive criticism in comments to give your opinion, absolutely no bother whatsoever, but just being disrespectful and slagging people off is a bit of a wasted effort. There's someone at the minute who just keeps watching my videos and slagging them off. It's like, you do know you can go somewhere else, don't you, son? It's just a bit weird, you know. It's like going to a sandwich shop and ordering a sandwich every day that you can't stand, complaining about it and still going back for another one. Crazy. But anyway, it is a tricky topic because obviously I haven't had ABA therapy, but I do know all about it because people tell me their stories about it. And there's enough videos, thankfully, on the internet to tell you all about it. And let me just explain why it's tricky to talk about. The reason it's tricky to talk about is because what will happen is you will have a set of parents, guardians, whoever it might be, who are looking after a child in their care, the dependent. They're looking after it. And that child might be diagnosed with autism. A lot of the time, parents who love their children don't want their children to ever suffer or have adversity or go through anything difficult at all. And a lot of people still see autism as a negative thing, a less than thing, something that's unfortunate. And it isn't. It absolutely isn't. Even to the point where adults who are diagnosed with autism still believe it's an unfortunate thing. People will tell me it's a living hell, this is a curse. But the reality is when you start getting to the bottom of the reasons people feel this way, it's not because they're autistic, it's because of the way they're being treated. It's because they haven't achieved at the societal milestones that other people might have done so. It's because they have been ostracized by family and other people like this. And again, when you dig deeper, you start to see that the reason they were treated differently wasn't because they had a bad attitude and were horrible to everyone. It's because they were autistic and they were treated badly by others. But you've really got to dig sometimes. You've really got to get into the crux of it because it's very easy to have this one-size-fits-all, autism's not great sort of attitude, because if everyone around you is telling you that, then that's going to sink in subconsciously, and then later in life you're diagnosed with autism and you're like, oh, I've got that, have I? Great. Well, actually, it is great, because I've took all the time in the world to unpick all of my previous biases that I might have had, the internalized ableism, as they call it, and I now know what autism is. And it is absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. If it wasn't for my autism, I would not be where I am now. And I don't mean sat here talking to you. I just mean in life. I've had a lot of things as a disadvantage, but hey, I can't help it if people treat me badly because I'm different to them. And that's the point. The point is, you are a parent, you care about your children, you don't want them to be disadvantaged. You try and find a way to help that child so that child isn't left behind, stays on track with their peers, doesn't stand out. And then what happens? The websites appear for ABA therapy, a nice smiley assistant, therapist, lots of testimonials, happy, safe, fun environment. we will get your child to be exactly where your child needs to be. And it's like, oh, okay, this is what I need. Because parents who love their children want the best for their children. But it's not always the case, especially where ABA is concerned. And the thing is, it's easy. I'll give you a perfect example as to why emotional thinking shouldn't be the thing that determines the path you go on. And that is because structure and discipline are more important in the upbringing of an autistic child than love and support. Now, there'll be parents screaming at me, but it's true. And why can I say it's true? Because I was an autistic child, and if I could have had my upbringing a different way, it would have been via that route. And when I say discipline, I don't mean dangling them off a building. I mean giving them the value of what is right and wrong. You know, and these are an autistic adult at the minute who I'm kind of trying to help. And I'm trying to help the people around him because to him, he's the world's greatest manipulator and nobody can figure him out. To me, it's as clear as day. And I'm telling them the thing to do is to tell him what he's going to do before he does it because he's exceptionally obvious. And because then he won't do it. He doesn't want to be seen as being predictable. You know, and that's because I see his predictability, but no one else can. You know, we can tell you things from being autistic that nobody else can tell you because it is a lived experience. Everybody else has to guess. This is why it blows my mind when people trust a non-autistic therapist or a non-autistic psychologist before they listen to a self-aware autistic adult. You know, I don't have affiliations. I'm not invested on one side or the other. I will give you an analysis and try and break it down. That matters because autism is still so our processing difference. You don't see it until it reaches certain points. But what about the rest of the time? The 99% of the time we're living, we're thinking, we're processing, we're feeling, we're understanding. No one's interested in that because it's not visual. But as an autistic parent to an autistic child who loves them unconditionally, who wants the best for that child, they don't want to hear that structure and discipline is more important than love and support. And they try to find a way to bring the child up to scratch because they're falling behind. They're not on track with their peers. And interestingly, I was speaking to someone not long ago who, say when they were around 11 years old, as the example, they were reading at the level of a 3-year-old. They then got a teacher who said, let's find how you learn. And within a year, they were reading at the top of the class. So it wasn't the fact that the child was at the disadvantage because they were autistic. It's because they were autistic and they were expected to learn via a way that their brain wasn't designed. That happens all the time. So when it comes to ABA therapy, the applied behavioural analysis therapy, what they will do is they will focus on compliance over autonomy. So they will demand you work and live a certain way as a child. You will sit down, you will read this book. If you do that, there will be a reward for doing so. And if you don't do it, there isn't a reward. And we're going to keep doing it until you do it, and then we'll reward you. But you don't even do that to a dog. You know, you have a dog, it still gets fed. But if you want a treat, you give me your paw. And the dog soon cottons on. It's like, all I've got to do is lift my leg up and I get some food. I'm having that. But ABA punishes. And from what I've just said about the guy who was 11 reading at a 3-year-old's level, until he found someone who helped him learn, found his way of learning. Not he had to conform to learning. The teacher conformed to the way the student could be taught, and within a year could read at top grade level. Even if you try to force a child, which you should never force, it's quite cruel. It's like an indoctrination, a brainwashing exercise. You must fit in or else. It's like giving everybody else an umbrella, and until you smile for me or give me eye contact, you don't get to put your umbrella up in the rain. No, that's not very nice, is it? But even if you force a child to conform, it doesn't mean you're going to make their brain wiring change where they will learn at the same way and the same pace as everyone else who's non-autistic around them. It means you've forced a square peg into a round hole. It means you've taken a fish and you're now judging it on its ability to climb a tree instead of putting it back in the water, which is the right thing to do. That's why it severely falls at the first hurdle. And like I've said, I don't care how fanciful your website is and how bright and colourful and all your testimonials. Because you've got to consider how that will impact that child. Why would you purposefully, even if you've got a reason you want to convince yourself of, why would you put a child through a punishment it hasn't deserved? It hasn't earned. That child might just want to sit there and arrange things instead of play with toys. That child might repeat the same process over and over again rather than do different things, and that winds you up rather than just accepting maybe the child likes doing that. The child gets punished for being different. How do you think that's going to impact them emotionally? How do you think that's going to help their wiring for the structure and the discipline, for what is right and what is wrong? If everything they do which is right to them, and it's actually not a negative thing, it's just a different thing, they're then told that everything they don't do is really the right thing. How do you think that's going to play with their morality in life in relation to, okay, so everything I think and do is wrong, everything I don't think and don't want to do is right? I don't think that's going to do well either. So you're forcing them to do something they don't want to do, telling them it's the right thing to do, going against the natural design of that child. Emotionally, psychologically, that's not going to do well. And there are controversial methods when you read about ABA therapy as well, which worry me greatly, especially the harsh methods. And it always comes via the way that you discipline the child. So if the child doesn't keep eye contact when it's talking to you, then that's a punishment. And again, I'm not talking about dangling them off buildings, threatening to drop them, but not rewarding them, not high-fiving them, not keeping it a calm environment. It's like you have to look at people in the eye when you talk to them. It's the polite thing to do. Sedu, you, because you're not autistic. How is that the polite thing to do? The rude thing to do when someone is talking to you is not listen to them. Looking at them is irrelevant. Otherwise, how did we get on with phone calls before a video phone was invented? It's because somebody is moving their mouth and their voice box, creating a noise that hits other people's ears. It doesn't need eyes. So a child will be punished for not maintaining eye contact because it's rude to look away when someone's talking to you. Maybe looking away is the way they can hear you. You don't punish because of that. Stimming, I still do it. I tap my fingers together. And stimming is a regulation. And it's a regulation because there might be an overload of something. You might be in an uncontrolled situation. Like, for example, if you go to a football stadium and there's 70,000 people, everybody else can just mill about and go into a stadium. Don't you think it's just slightly strange that you spend your entire life not around 69,999 other people and then you are? That is allowed to cause you an overload because there is an overload. So if visually and audibly that is causing you a bit of a concern and I might need to tap my fingers, why can't I just regulate myself? Why do you see stimming as a concern? Don't let it bother you because it's actually not a negative thing. It's negative to not let people stim because then they're not regulated. That can then lead to a burnout or more likely a meltdown, even a shutdown. And there are differences. But put it this way, let's find an example. You've got a pan of water on the gas, on the stove, and you don't pay attention to it, and you've got the gas applied, and it starts to bubble the water, and it starts to overflow. Tapping my fingers is turning the gas down or lifting the pan off the flame. Now, the pan is still allowed to boil, but it doesn't need to become volatile. And I'm not saying it's volatility where I'll lash out at other people. I might just need to completely get out of there as quickly as possible and retreat to my safe space. But what I'm saying is ABA therapy reinforces certain behaviours and punishes others. And it punishes natural things that autistic people do. Otherwise, they wouldn't be amongst the vast amount of autistic people out there. They wouldn't have names. This wouldn't be known as stimming. You know, the eye contact thing, we wouldn't have examples of that. I won't be able to mock it with my telephone example. We need to do it because that's our design, and our design is not wrong just because it's different, and that's the problem. We're being treated as if we're wrong because we're different. The reality is it's wrong to think the difference is wrong, because the only time it should be treated that way is if we're doing something detrimental, and we're not. We're actually receiving detriment by people not accepting that it's all right to be different. And that's what further leads to the stereotypes within autism, because we're constantly being the square peg forced to fit into the round hole. We don't fit. We make a bit of noise while you're trying to ram us in, and we're like, oh, what you lashing out for? So much of the way autism is perceived on the negative side is based off reaction, because people don't want to know how we learn. They don't want to know how we operate. They don't want to know why our world is all right to operate different. You know, I sit here before you now to tail off a slight part, but I chose never to have children because I really thought about it. I paid a lot of attention into it, and that's something that I didn't want to apply to my life. And I'm still told by people today who don't even know me, you're wrong for the decision you made. And yet I watch social services and so many broken homes and so many children being bounced around the foster system because their parents, and I'm only generalising on a few, might be drug takers, might have domestic violence, might have alcohol issues, other substance issues, unsafe environments for children. And I appreciate it's also there for the people in severe misfortune too. But there are still people who make conscious efforts and still let people down. I made a decision that was for the best, and the audacity of people who think they can overrule my mindset just because they think different to me. Whereas I accept people who wanted children and didn't. It's their choice, no problem. So my mind accepts other people's doesn't. And this is what ABA is for. It's not accepting that autistic children exist. Difference in thought exists. Acting different is not allowed, as if it is something bad. But don't you think it's bad to not accept it? I do. Don't you think it's bad that education doesn't want to tweak slightly to try and accommodate the way autistic people learn? I do. And that's where the irony sits, isn't it, my friends? The irony sits. If you read the traits of autism, of which there are not, because it's not a condition, it's a difference, it will tell you that we are inflexible of thought. But we live in a world where from behind these eyes, all I see is nobody wants to be flexible to me. You take reasonable adjustments in a workplace. There has to be a law introduced in England to force employers to be reasonable. We put a mask on for everybody else so they feel comfortable. We request the slightest thing and people lose their minds. But people don't want to pay attention to that because that is the majority of non-autistic people. Again, autistic people sharing lived experiences, you'll learn all about it. But they don't want to hear their own fault. They want to then cast the blame onto us as if we're doing something wrong for just simply trying to exist peacefully. That's not fair. And it's unfair. Children have to suffer because parents, unfortunately and subconsciously, haven't realised the bias they've built towards autism, the way they feel about it, how their child is going to get punished for just not being neurotypical. You shouldn't be punished for having a difference. But that's what happens to children. And if you don't believe me, I appreciate I'm just a guy waffling and bumping his gums. But the internet, YouTube, is riddled with people sharing real life experiences. Parents who put their children through ABA therapy and the child is now traumatized from it because they've been forced on a continual basis until they broke to conform. But instead they didn't break to conform, they just broke. Why would you do that to your own children? And I appreciate it's all done with the greatest of intention. You just don't want your child to be left behind, but you've got to pay attention to these people. Pay attention to the autistic people who went through it and how it felt for them. YouTube, thankfully, is still a free resource. Watch as many videos as you can. It's very important you take that advice rather than coming across a nice, shiny, fun, happy, friendly website that enforces the use of ABA therapy with a lot of testimonials. The hardest person for me to ever talk to, non-autistic or autistic, are non-autistic parents of young autistic children, because they have the protection in them and everything I say doesn't sound protective. But the reality is I am actually the one trying to protect them, but in a very realistic and sensical way, which is actually in their design. We don't get to break that, unfortunately. So autistic voices, autistic perspectives matter because we are the ones who would go through it. You know, if you had someone who was a prisoner of war, as an example, you would listen to the prisoner of war. You wouldn't listen to some guy who read a book on it. Unfortunately, in autism, nobody wants to listen to us. They want to listen to other people who might be associated with autism. But here's a thing I will tell you. There are people who can help. There are people who can assist you in the best way to raise your autistic child, because we do have a mental difference. Just like there's Apple and Android, that's the difference. We're just two different operating systems. That's all. One isn't better than the other. There's a preference on either side for why you need it, why you want it, what the way it works, the way we operate. There are people who can assist you in tapping into understanding that way. If you're not familiar with it, there are people who understand autism very well. There are people who have worked with many autistic children across many different types of parents. They can help you learn how to learn and teach via the autistic mindset to help raise your child so they're not at a disadvantage, which they would be if you continually expect them to be at the standard of their non-autistic counterparts. You don't expect a Rottweiler to do the same as a tabby cat. You know, just because they both exist in this world with tails and four legs, it doesn't mean they're the same thing. We're not the same thing. We have a completely different wiring in our brain, but it doesn't make us wrong, flawed, or defective. It makes us different. What's wrong, flawed, and defective is believing that there's a disadvantage to this. We learn different. That's it. Learn the way your child learns, and you will have hacked into the best resource you possibly can. And there are good therapists who can help you do that, I'm sure. But here's a sign of a good therapist. They don't ever announce or use ABA therapy, because they will even know that that's not the right way for an autistic mind. If they promote ABA therapy, they don't know an autistic mind, hence why they're trying to force them to conform. And they shouldn't be doing that. I know it all sounds exceptionally simple, doesn't it? And it's very easy to point at me and go, but Paul, you haven't got kids you wouldn't understand. Yes, I do, because I was an autistic child and I know the best thing that would have worked for me. I speak to too many autistic people these days, and I hear all the stories. I know the way our mind works because I have one. And, you know, I like to give you an education perspective. I was terrible in a classroom. I could not learn. And I was given the false perception that I was thick, stupid. I mustn't know what I'm doing. I took it upon myself to wonder why I couldn't learn. And I found that I learned via pattern recognition training. So there's no point in giving me everything I'm supposed to learn, expect me to retain it and throw it on an exam. You are supposed to show me the pattern in how it all comes together, why we're doing what we're doing. And when I find all these individual parts that knit together, my mind will stitch them together. It all falls into place, and now I am the one you come to for advice on that. Because I become a subject matter expert. And the only thing that was different is the way I was taught. And that's the key. Your child might be autistic. They might be at the bottom of their class. It is not because they're autistic. It's because of the way they're being expected to learn. And don't get me wrong. I'm not going to say that it isn't going to be a problem for some. A lot of people with autism have comorbidities, with an intellectual disability being number one in the comorbidity charts. But an intellectual disability isn't autism, it's an intellectual disability. So maybe the reason they're not learning is due to that. But when it is solely autism, as I sit here without an intellectual disability, I'm telling you it's about the methodology in which you find to teach your child via their mindset. The skill is there. It's like being presented with 100 locks and you've been given 100 keys. Take your time to try them all, because one will undo that lock. People can help you with that. Autistic people are the best at trying to help with that. You'd be surprised how many people just want a platform to be able to help others when they're autistic, have their opinion asked for. They will be happy to help, free of charge. It's just unfortunate we live in a world where everyone is an opportunist. And an opportunist will look at emotional parents and think, here is a money-making scheme. They will try and force your child through the ringer, and when your child doesn't take to it or breaks from it, they'll find a reason to blame the child rather than blame the fact that they've tried to apply something that doesn't work. It is the square peg for the round hole. It's not right. There is a peg for this hole. You've just got to find it. So even though I can't show you the ins and outs of the ABA therapy, I can tell you the way an autistic mind works and tell you that ABA therapy is not in the design process that we need. I strongly implore any parent of any autistic child to never put your child through ABA. If you've thought about doing it, please don't. If you've started, please stop. If you've done it and you thought it worked to treat, unfortunately, you will have caused some emotional distress to your child, which may have resulted in a trauma. I hope that can be undone. To people raising autistic children, please don't expect them to fit in with the rest of the world, because the rest of the world expects them to. Let them have their world and let them know it's all right to live in, because that's when you'll start to see your child thrive. And yes, I don't have children, but I was one. I am a self-aware autistic adult. I know what works for people like me. I know what works for people similar to me. And then it starts getting a little bit hazy after that. But I know full well how our mind works. Like I said, I speak to far too many autistic people these days to know that I'm not wrong when it comes to the design of an autistic mind. The flaw is the fact that we're not accepted. That's not victim mentality. It's a fact. Again, there's enough free resource out there to see how our difference is not accepted. It's taken as a threat. And we're not threat-based responders. We are defense-based responders. But you won't hear that either, because you need to hear it from an autistic perspective. But anyway, whatever you do, to have the best in mind for your child, please stay away from ABA therapies. And until we get to catch up again soon, my friends, thank you very much for watching, and keep smiling.